Welcome to In the News with Double O Des. I'm Des Bernardo, giving you my perspective on news from South Africa and the rest of the world. In this articles I'm bringing you now, and I'm covering quite a few of them, I bring you the month-end statistics on the coronavirus deaths. Now, I don't need to mention how many people have actually died because there's very few compared to the models that were put out there. And my focus of this video is basically the modeling and how terribly flawed the modeling has been from the very beginning. And I will cover one article with you. I'll give you quite a few links to look at. News 24 actually went and changed the original models that they put out and graphs that they put out in April of last year, because it was such an embarrassment that they actually started it now from June. When the original started from March, when the pandemic started, and actually went from June through to November. Remember, they said that by the end of June, 20,000 people would have died. And I said I'll give you an update in the middle of June, which I did. And then I will give you an update at the end of June. The reason why I'm giving you the update now, it's the 29th, we've got 2 days to go, and I don't think that we're going to have 17,000 people die in this specific period of time. There's no reason to believe that. So besides the fact that the people that are claimed to have died from the COVID-19 disease, that we actually have no proof that they died from COVID-19. These are people that have been tested positive for the SARS-CoV-2 virus and subsequently passed on. So to make that clear, we have zero evidence that COVID-19 disease, because we don't actually understand the disease fully, was the cause of death. Just to make that clear. So in many cases, the people might have died from many other things. We know that in the Western Cape, based on the stats, more than 80% of the people that pass on is because of comorbidities. And in 60% of the people, there are more than 3 comorbidities. In other words, 3 life-threatening diseases that would actually end up causing the people to pass on. So it's really sad that that is happening, but to actually blame COVID-19 disease for that is disingenuous, and it's actually a lie. It's just not the truth, and what the public needs is the truth. So once again, the virus exists. The virus is real. The disease that the SARS-CoV-2 virus causes is called COVID-19. The scientists and medical practitioners are still trying to find out exactly what COVID-19 is. There's so many different things happening to people that we know don't happen because of other viral or bacterial or other types of infections. So we know that there are new things present, but they're trying to find out what these are. So the virus has definitely had an impact, but not the impact that they thought. And this is the key, because we were locked down for many things that never ended up happening. Now, in the first exclusive article on News 24, it said the terrifying coronavirus projections that pushed government into action. And I put a link to this article to my first video on the death numbers. And that article, they have gone and changed since. And that's actually quite sad, because in a later article, they start at June. They don't actually show their projections from March, when they started with the madness, up until this point. Because remember, initially we didn't actually know, or the government didn't know, what the virus would cause. So taking initial action makes sense to most people. But within a month's time, we started getting statistics in from around the world, and I love statistics, and I like to disseminate statistics, and I actually know how to do that quite well. I did it for a living. So when you actually look at the statistics that they sent through, the initial modeling was not only shocking, the assumptions they made was unscientific and really pathetic. And based on this modeling, they started the lockdown and started this state of disaster, okay, with all its rules and regulations. Now, at that stage, what they said is with a 10% infection rate, okay, the projected deaths would be 87,900. They didn't give a time frame for this. With 20%, 176,000 deaths. With 40%, 351,000 deaths. So this is what they say that President Cyril Ramaphosa was presented with, and based on this, he made the decisions that he made. But the article that I'll cover just now will show you how grossly unscientific this was. And I will post the links to all of these articles so you can go through them and make up your own mind. You don't have to believe what I say. In fact, I don't want you to believe what I say. So there's many articles in the Daily Maverick. Here's what the models predict about COVID-19 in South Africa. And then it predicts all the different deaths, and it talks about 34,000 to 50,000 deaths by November. Now at this rate of deaths, we are nowhere near what they predicted. And I am very sure that they are all going to have egg on their faces because the evidence suggests something completely different. In Ground-Up, there was an article where it speaks about the difference between males and females through the different age categories, and all the questions that people had around exactly the same graphs. And looking at the rest of the world, and at the time they were questioning, what's the fuss about smoking? And they say, yeah, there's been a huge fuss about a study by French researchers, not yet published in a peer-reviewed journal, that found that the number of current and former smokers in 482 COVID-19 patients were proportionally lower than the French population, which meant that in their evidence, based on evidence of 482 people, that smokers had less of a degree of COVID-19 development after they've tested positive for the virus. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there. I want to get to what is actually happening right now and what the foremost expert on this has actually said. And just to cover the article that News24 ran on the 20th of May, where they actually went and changed their charts to start from June, the beginning of June, which is a cheat. They should have kept the ones that started from March, from the declaration of the pandemic. But they went and hid it. They actually took the exact same curve and they just moved it up. So you can actually go and look at it. It's quite pathetic. But this is what they do. They crook. You know, the mainstream media like to crook. But what I want to cover with you now is an article in businesslive.co.za, and it says South Africa's COVID-19 models were flawed, says former NICD expert. It says former NICD because remember, the NICD was an organization that would allow any press releases or any information to go out to the public with regards to COVID-19. In fact, when the disaster was declared, it's the first thing the president did was say that all medical staff are gagged. You're not allowed to say anything. The media is gagged. You're not allowed to say anything unless the NICD approves what you say. Dictatorship, anyone? And he said, and no one is modeling the collateral damage of the lockdown, this professor said. And I've dealt with this professor before, Shabir Mahdi, who's actually come up in our defense. He's actually thinking rationally, and I really appreciate that this professional that's doing that. And he says, and the impact of the economic meltdown on disease and death. So he's thinking about other diseases and other deaths created because of the absolute madness of what our government has gone and done. And I want to cover this article in detail, so I will give you 3 to 4 links on articles that you can go and read up on. It says here the modeling of how many people would contract COVID-19 and die was flawed and illogical and made wild assumptions, said Professor Shabir Mahdi, the former head of SA's National Institute for Communicable Diseases. Now, he's not the head anymore. This is what happens to you when you speak the truth. It's an important claim not just because of Mahdi's stature, he also co-ran the SA Medical Research Council, but also because the COVID-19 model, which suggested between 87,000 and 350,000 deaths, which I mentioned earlier from the other article, and you can see it in that link, which I'll put in the comments below the video. It was instrumental in the government's decision to implement a lockdown. This is the problem. They base their decisions on this rubbish. And when things are unscientific and it's rubbish, and you destroy a country because of it, you need to be held to account. Because it means that the person in that position didn't ask the right questions. They didn't say, how much can your model be off by? Show me the evidence. They did none of that because it all suited many other objectives, New World Order agendas and ideologies. Let's continue. The government's initial model also predicted that 600 COVID-19 patients would need treatment in intensive care units, ICU, in South Africa by April 1st. How ironic. But by April 18th, the last publicly released figures showed there were 32 COVID-19 patients in ICU. 32 instead of 600. I mean, that's not off by a small margin. It's not even a factor of 10. It's a huge factor that it's off by. So these people had no cooking clue what they were doing. While the lockdown would have slowed the spread of the disease, and all of us would admit that, it had only been in place for 4 days by April the 1st. So this was likely not the reason why there were so few ICU patients. Mari says the initial modeling and fatality estimates were back of envelope calculations. And I love the fact that he says this, because this guy is a straight shooter just like me. He says someone just scribbled this on the back of an envelope because he didn't actually have the time to do a proper assessment. There's no science involved here. There were people in positions. There was probably a need first from our New World Order agency stooges to do certain things. And this is more evidence for that. That an entire government would just blindly follow something recommended to them by the WHO, World Health Organization, a subsidiary of the United Nations, complete and utter New World Order organization. Okay? The models were prepared by the South African Centre of Epidemiological Modeling and Analysis, SAKIMA, at Stellenbosch University, as well as the NICD. They used data from Wuhan, the Chinese city where the outbreak began. The SAKIMA model modeled its fatality projections around different scenarios in which 10, 20% and 40% of the population contracted the virus. Mari says he raised problems with the model at the time. So he said he raised his concern. Nowhere in the world, not even in Wuhan, had 10% of the population contracted the virus. I told him that at the start. This is implausible, he tells. He said it was implausible to them at the time. He claims the model was not sufficiently flexible to adjust for infection rates depending on how many other people in the population had contracted the virus. As it is, the more people who are infected, the fewer new people a contagious person can potentially affect. And this is the beauty of someone that has a scientific mind. He realizes that the more people that have the virus, the less people that you can actually infect. This week, the FM asked Professor Juliet Pulliam, the head of SAKIMA, why their model was based on a minimum 10% infection rate and whether they still believe deaths would be as high as initially predicted. Pulliam responds, the model you refer to was a preliminary assessment that was based on the best available information at the time. A new modeling report will be released by the NICD this week. However, SAKIMA's model, which was instrumental in shaping public policy, could have been distributed for review by other experts in real time. This is an approach adopted by some other countries. This is an obvious thing. When you do something like this, where you take people's livelihood away, their very work, their way of survival, which has caused so many deaths due to suicide and many other things, then you need to seriously think what you are doing. You can't base it on some scientific model that hasn't been peer-reviewed. It's absolute madness. In its defense, SAKIMA's model isn't the only one to be adjusted downward. The UK's Imperial College of London, and this will ring a bell with some of my other articles, initially predicted huge numbers of deaths, including 2.2 million in the US, but has since been toned down. Okay, and they do this on the sly. They make everything lower because they said there would be 20,000 deaths in June. Not by the end of June, they said in June. Do we have 20,000 deaths? And that was their best case estimate at the time. Best case. However, its initial figure of 350,000 deaths were frightening, 10 times more than the number of people who die annually of tuberculosis. SA's biggest killer. Mari says those mortality rates were based on wild assumptions. You cannot have wild assumptions in science, but this is the order of the day. And I'm sure my good friend Justice Killian at Agenda 21 Truth South Africa would like to take the mickey out of these wild assumptions that scientists make these days. You can't call it science anymore. I don't know what you should call it. Politicking, maybe funding, maybe many other things, but science it certainly is not. Mari himself estimates that over the next 2 years, there may be 43,000 COVID-19 fatalities in South Africa. This is over a 2-year period. As the virus waxes and wanes, this year he estimates there will be 25,000 deaths. That's within the year, not June or July. Okay, what they say that we want is a smarter strategic response. That 25,000 number sounds high, but Mari says that's probably equal to the number of people who die of TB in South Africa each year, which would never lead to a national lockdown. So what he's saying is that many people die of TB in South Africa and we still won't lock the country down because of it, and it's highly contagious and infectious. In part, he says this is because TB is out of sight, a disease of the poor which predominantly kills in the rural areas. There he is saying something very important. People not wanting to see the inconvenient truth. Stats South Africa figures show that in 2017, 25,336 people died of diabetes and 22,259 died of cerebrovascular disease, which includes strokes and aneurysms. That year, 28,678 people died of TB. Okay, this is 2017. Mari says the COVID-19 deaths, however, are likely to happen within a short period during winter when hospitals typically have a high number of flu cases too. Typically, hospital wards reach 90% capacity with peak flu cases, and COVID-19 could make this a lot worse. This appears to have been the rationale behind locking down the country and slowing transmission. However, public opposition to the lockdown has grown steadily as the economic situation worsens. Experts estimate that more than 1 million people lose their jobs and the economy will shrink by more than 6%, while we know it's a lot worse than that. Mari argues that the initial lockdown was necessary to increase hospital preparations and testing and to slow transmission so that the hospital system is not overwhelmed. That makes perfect rational sense, and most people in South Africa would have no problem with that. The fact that fewer people use taxis and the affluent stayed at home has definitely slowed the spread of the virus, he says. The problem is, he says, that there isn't enough testing happening, nor enough isolation beds for people with COVID-19 who live in high-density areas, which doesn't mean the government isn't trying. 2,000 beds are being prepared for quarantine at the Nasrec Expo Center. The NICD, an agency of the Department of Health, has previously told the Financial Mail that it cannot make its models public due to a confidentiality agreement with the department. But this means it's not possible for epidemiologists to review and critique the assumptions. Now, this is utter madness. How can you use models that affects my life and your life and you won't make them public to be scrutinized? Madness. Mari also warned that no one is modeling the collateral damage. And this is the key and what I want to focus on with a specific article. The collateral damage of the lockdown and the impact of the economic meltdown on disease and death. He says the government's focus is on decreasing infections and fatality rather than a broader picture. And this is what the evidence suggests right now. The evidence suggests everything has been COVID, SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV-2. And they haven't focused on anything else. People are not going to hospital and people are dying because hospitals have been cleared up to just receive COVID-19 patients. This is madness. Absolute madness. Mari also warned that no one is modeling the collateral damage of the lockdown and the impact of the economic meltdown on the disease and death. He says the government's focus has just been on the infections instead of the broader picture. So there's no model being prepared for what happens to people now, losing their jobs. Can we see stats on that and models on that, predictions on it? Did they even think of that? Did they think of how many people will now be too afraid to go to hospital and model that? Seeing that they're so good at modeling something they know nothing about and still know nothing about. Because they still know nothing about COVID-19, that I can assure you. At this point, the economic impact is unclear. Neither economists nor business leaders have provided an estimate of life years lost because of the increase in unemployment. However, as Mari reports, poverty can make things worse. It increases the risk of contracting TB in high-density settings. like informal settings, and fuels HIV infections as women trade their bodies for money, to cite just a few examples. And then there's a cautionary tale from the DRC just to end off. However, a bad response to a disease can be disastrous. In the DRC, a strict Ebola response decreased movement and led to a halt in the country's wider disease vaccine program. The Ebola outbreak killed 3,500 people, but the country that had to deal with the world's worst measles outbreak, which left more than 6,000 children dead. The World Health Organization Director Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said, while the world strives to develop a new vaccine for COVID-19 at record speed, we must not risk losing the fight to protect everyone everywhere against vaccine-preventable diseases. These diseases will come roaring back if we do not vaccinate. See, everything is about vaccines to these people. Mario himself is a global expert in vaccine science. He's particularly worried about how few vaccinations for measles have been given to children in South Africa over the past month. Now, we know that the measles vaccine, which is just meant for measles, has been around for a very long time, has saved many people's lives. So, like I said before, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, and Dr. Mari, I've discussed with you before in an article, his concerns with how they're developing the vaccines and how they're rushing through tests and many other things that he's concerned about. It seems like he has a sound head on his shoulders. He makes scientific sense when he speaks, and I understand exactly where he's coming from. He's asked many of the questions that I asked initially. He is saying that these models are flawed. Obviously, people that speak truth to power get sidelined. And it won't be long before you won't have any position to say anything in South Africa anymore, and that is sad. But hopefully we can pull him in again when we have a new government and we've replaced the current incompetent bunch with a new system, and hopefully a new electoral system, which has to be, for which is only 23 months left now. 23 months for Parliament to come up with a new electoral act, because the current one is unconstitutional. They've duped us for many years. I haven't been duped. I've been fighting this for some time. From the moment that I started getting interested in politics in South Africa and got actively involved, I have been fighting the system that we are caught up in right now. And I've seen how people in politics don't want the system to change. They want it to stay the same, because that is what's ensuring their jobs. Their incompetent jobs are being ensured by the current system. And I want you to help me to fight this. Remember the hashtag direct elections. Remember hashtag direct elections, to put that in your posts, to make that mainstream, the concept of direct elections. I'm glad that I could share this with you. Look where we're at. We're at the end of June. There's no 20,000 deaths. They were wrong. They based all of their actions on these predictions. And this was the best case prediction. There was a prediction as high as 40,000 by end of June. 40,000. They were way off. They didn't understand what they were dealing with, and that's fine. But then don't shut an entire country down and keep us shut down if what you're doing makes no sense. If we have other diseases in this country that we know is far worse and killing a lot more people, that we've never done a lockdown for, maybe we should take more precautions with regards to those diseases. I thank you. Till the next video.